There was a night, many winters ago, when a man came to me at the very edge of his own ruin. He had built a life that any rational observer would have called a triumph, a fine house, a respected name, a family that admired him, and yet he sat in my study trembling as though something deep within him had already begun to crumble. He told me he had dreamed of standing in an empty house, watching a stranger die slowly in the next room, and that he could not bring himself to open the door and look. I listened in the silence, and I understood almost at once that the stranger behind that door was himself. The death he feared was not the death of his body. It was the death of the man he had always believed himself to be. You will see this only once. The moment I am speaking of arrives for almost no one twice, because by the time it comes, the one who might have witnessed it a second time is already gone. It is the threshold where the all self stands at the door of its own dissolution, and for a single terrible luminous instant it sees clearly what it has been, every mask, every compromise, every quiet betrayal of the soul. Most people spend the whole of their lives arranging with extraordinary cleverness never to arrive at that door. And yet the door waits for each of us, patient as the grave, certain as the morning. I have sat with many men and women in the hour when their constructed identity began to fall away. And I can tell you that it does not feel like growth. It feels like dying. The personality you have spent decades assembling, the careful persona, the borrowed opinions, the ambitions you inherited without ever having chosen them, begins to loosen at its seams. And the panic that rises is the oldest panic there is. The ego senses the approach of something larger than itself, and it does what any frightened animal does. It bares its teeth, and it calls the transformation a catastrophe. But here is the detail that most people overlook, precisely where they least expect to find it. The thing that comes to kill the old self is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been waiting in the dark for permission to live. Let me speak plainly about what is actually happening in such an hour, because the language we use for it matters enormously. What you call yourself in ordinary life is for the most part the ego, that bright, busy point of consciousness that says asterisk, I asterisk, and believes it is the master of the house. The ego is not an illusion. It is necessary as a lantern is necessary in a vast cave, but it is small. It knows only the lit circle of its own awareness, and it mistakes that circle for the whole of the world. Beneath it, around it, beyond it, stretches the unconscious personal and collective both, an ocean of which the ego is merely a wave that has briefly learned to call itself a man. The true center of the psyche is not the ego at all. I have called it the self with a capital letter to distinguish it from the small self that worries and plans and defends. The self is the totality, the conscious and the unconscious held together as one living whole, the ground from which the ego rose and to which in the end it must return for its instructions. The process by which a person slowly turns from being governed by the ego to being centered in the self is what I named asterisk individuation, asterisk. And individuation, I must warn you, is not a gentle improvement of the personality. It is a death and a rebirth. It cannot happen unless something is allowed to end. This is why the old self must die, not destroyed in violence, not amputated in self-hatred, but dissolved, the way the alchemists of old spoke of asterix, solutio asterix, the dissolving of the fixed and hardened thing back into the formless waters from which a truer form could emerge. The man in my study had become hardened. His persona had grown so rigid, so successful, so admired, that it had sealed him off entirely from the living waters beneath. And the unconscious, which is never patient forever, had finally begun to crack the shell. You may notice that you recognize this in your own life, in moments you have never named. The strange grief that visits a person at the height of their achievement, the hollowness that arrives precisely when everything is at last going well. That is not ingratitude. That is the soul, knocking at the door of a house that no longer has room for it. What mythology has been trying to tell us for thousands of years is this single repeating truth told in 100 tongues. There is no resurrection that does not pass through the tomb. Consider Osiris, the bright god of the Egyptians, who was murdered by his own brother Set, dismembered and scattered in fragments across the whole of the land. Only after his body had been gathered, piece by scattered piece, and reassembled by Isis, did he rise to rule the realm of the dead and become the very judge of souls. The Egyptians understood something we have forgotten, that the path to becoming a king of the deeper world runs first through dismemberment. The old wholeness, which was no true wholeness at all, but only an unexamined unity, had to be torn apart before a greater unconscious wholeness could be born from the pieces. Or consider Inanna, the queen of heaven in the old Sumerian tale, who descended into the underworld of her dark sister Ereshkigal. At each of the 7 gates, she was stripped of one of her adornments, her crown, her jewels, her garments, until she arrived in the depths utterly naked, utterly powerless. And there she was struck down and hung as a corpse upon a hook. Only after 3 days in that death was she sprinkled with the water of life and permitted to return. The myth is merciless in its honesty. It does not say she descended and returned unchanged. It says she had to be stripped of everything she identified with and to die entirely before she could ascend as something more. The hero of every great myth in every land and every age must at some point leave the lit village of the known and descend into the belly of the monster, into the labyrinth, into the dark forest where the path has not yet been made. Jonah was swallowed by the great fish and lay 3 days in its lightless belly before he was cast up upon the shore, changed. The hero enters the cave he most fears, and it is always, without exception, in that very cave that the treasure he has been seeking lies hidden. This is no accident of storytelling. It is the soul's own map, drawn again and again across the centuries, telling us that what we most need is buried in the one place we are most afraid to go. And the figure who waits in that darkness is older than any hero. She is a great mother who is at once the womb and the tomb, the one who gives birth and the one who devours, the earth from which we rise and the earth that receives us back. To descend into her is to return to the place before the ego was born, the formless and oceanic origin, and it is precisely this that the small self experiences as annihilation. For the ego cannot conceive of a death that is also a return. It knows only its own ending, and it screams against it. But the deeper psyche knows better. It has made this journey before in every generation that ever lived, and it remembers the way back up. The alchemists, those secret psychologists in their smoke-filled chambers, call this first and most necessary stage the asterisk nigredo, asterisk, the blackening. Before the gold could appear, before the asterisk albedo asterisk, the whitening, and the asterisk rubido asterisk, the reddening of the completed work, the matter in the vessel had first to rot, to blacken, to decompose into a putrid and lightless mass. They were not, of course, truly seeking to make ordinary gold. They were projecting the drama of their own souls onto the matter in the flask. And what they witnessed there was the death of their old and base nature, so that the philosopher's stone, the symbol of the integrated and indestructible self, could be born from its corruption. And what Jung saw, sitting with patient after patient over a lifetime of listening, was deeply unsettling in its consistency. The same sequence that the myths described and the alchemists enacted in their vessels was unfolding in our own age, in the dreams of bankers and housewives and engineers who had never read a single line of myth or alchemy. The psyche had not changed. It still demanded the descent. It still required the death. It still produced, from the depths of the asterisk collective unconscious asterisk, the very same images of dismemberment and dissolution and rebirth that our ancestors carved into stone. There is a serpent that the ancients drew, swallowing its own tail. The asterisk are Apollo's asterisk, and I have never found a truer image for this whole mystery. It is the symbol of that which consumes itself in order to renew itself, the end that is also the beginning, the death that feeds the life. To watch your old self die is to watch the serpent reach its own tail at last. It is terrible. It is also the most natural thing in the world. But here we must turn from the ancient mirror to our own faces. For the spirit of our time has done something peculiar and dangerous with this old knowledge. It has tried to abolish death altogether, not only the death of the body, which it postpones with all the power of its medicine, but the death of the self, which it has learned to deny with all the power of its distractions. Modern man has built a civilization devoted, above all else, to the preservation and the perfection of the persona. We are taught from our earliest years to construct an image, to curate it, to defend it, and never under any circumstances to let it die. And now, in this strange new age of glowing screens, the persona has escaped the body entirely and taken on a luminous life of its own. A person no longer merely wears a mask. He photographs the mask, refines the mask, and presents the mask 1,000 times a day to 1,000 strangers, until at last he can no longer find a living face beneath it. The persona, which was meant to be a useful garment, has become a coffin in which the soul is buried alive. I once said that modern man has lost his gods, but not his need for them. He banished the deities from Olympus, and they did not die. They descended into the unconscious, where they rule him still, more tyrannically than ever, precisely because he no longer knows their names. The gods of the old world demanded sacrifice. The gods of the unconscious demand it still. And the sacrifice they require, the one we are most desperate to avoid, is the sacrifice of the false and inflated self. This is why our age is so full of a suffering it cannot explain. The depressions that arrive without external cause, the exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure, the vague and gnawing sense that one is living someone else's life, performing a role one never auditioned for. I observed, across the long years of my practice, that these summons most often arrive near the middle of a life, in that strange and luminous afternoon of our existence, when the goals of the morning have for the most part been achieved, and the person discovers with a quiet horror that achieving them has not made him whole. The first half of life is rightly given to building the ego, to making a place in the world, to constructing the persona and the career and the name. But the second half belongs to something altogether different. It belongs to meaning, to depth, to the turning inward, to the long task of becoming who one truly is, rather than who one was expected to be. And the tragedy of our age is that we have built a civilization that knows only the morning. We carry the ambitions and the appetites of youth into the afternoon and the evening of life, and we wonder, bewildered, why they have curdled into despair. The old self that was perfectly suited to the morning must die for the afternoon to begin its proper work. These are not always sicknesses to be medicated into silence. Very often, they are the first knocking of the unconscious upon the door, the soul announcing that the old self has outlived its purpose and must now be allowed to die, so that a truer life may begin. The real turning point begins right here in how a person chooses to answer that knock. For the old self does not surrender its throne willingly, and it has at its disposal the most ingenious defense in all of nature. It calls asterisk projection asterisk to its aid. When the contents of the unconscious begin to stir, when the shadow rises and the disowned parts of ourselves demand to be seen, the ego performs a brilliant and disastrous trick. Rather than recognizing these contents as its own, it flings them outward and sees them in other people. The qualities a man most violently despises in his neighbor are, with astonishing regularity, the very qualities he has refused to acknowledge in himself. This is why I have said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The enemy you cannot stop thinking about is wearing your own disowned face. And so long as you are at war with him out there, you will never have to face the harder war within. This is the darkest game the unconscious plays, and modern man plays it on a vast and collective scale. Whole nations project their asterisk, collective shadow asterisk onto other nations, other races, other creeds, and call the resulting hatred righteousness. The shadow that a people refuses to integrate within itself does not vanish. It gathers force in the dark and erupts, eventually, as the catastrophes of history. I lived through such a time, and I watched a cultured and civilized people give themselves over wholly to a possession by their own denied darkness. The lesson was carved into me forever. What we will not face within ourselves, we are condemned to enact upon the world. So how then does a person consent to the death of the old self without being destroyed by it? For this is the question on which everything turns, and I will not insult you by pretending I have a formula. There is no technique that accomplishes it. No method you can purchase, no 7 simple steps. There is only a posture of the soul, a willingness to descend, consciously and with open eyes, into the very depths the ego has spent a lifetime avoiding. The first movement of this descent is the meeting with the shadow. You must come to know the parts of yourself that you have hidden even from your own awareness, the cruelty, the cowardice, the envy, the hunger, all the unlived and unwanted material that your respectable persona could not afford to include. This is not a wallowing in guilt. It is an act of profound honesty and ultimately of mercy toward yourself. For the shadow, when it is faced rather than fled, surrenders an extraordinary gift. It returns the vital energy that was bound up in its repression. The man who can say asterisk, yes, this too is me, asterisk discovers to his astonishment that he is suddenly larger, warmer, more alive, more whole. I have often guided people into the practice I came to call asterisk active imagination, asterisk, in which one descends deliberately into the images of the unconscious, not asleep, but awake, allowing the figures of the inner world to appear and permitting oneself to enter into living dialogue with them. And there is the patient, nightly work of attending to one's dreams. For the dream is the small hidden door into the deepest recesses of the soul, the place where the psyche speaks in its own true and pictorial language, unguarded by the daylight ego, through asterisk amplification asterisks, by setting a dream image beside its echoes in myth and fairy tale and ancient symbol. The small private suffering of a single soul is revealed as a chapter in the oldest human story there is. You are not alone in your dying. Everyone who ever became more than they were has stood exactly where you stand. And here we arrive at the deepest paradox of all, the still center around which this entire mystery turns. The death you fear so completely is the very thing your soul has been longing for. The ego, peering toward its own dissolution, sees only annihilation, only the end of everything it knows. But it is wrong. It cannot see past its own horizon. What it experiences as its death is in truth its transformation, not the extinction of consciousness, but its enthronement upon a far greater foundation. The wave does not cease to exist when it remembers the ocean. It becomes at last what it always was. This is the law I named asterisk in enantiodromia asterisk, the tendency of all things, when carried to their extreme, to turn into their own opposite. The deepest darkness gives birth to light. The lowest point of the descent is also the secret beginning of the ascent. At the very bottom of the asterisk, nigredo asterisk, when the matter in the vessel was blackest and most corrupt, and the alchemist most despaired, the first faint whitening of the asterisk, albedo asterisk, would appear as the dawn appears, not in spite of the night, but precisely out of it. So it is that the moment of the old self's death is also in the same instant the moment of the new self's birth. The two are not separated by time. They are a single event, seen from two directions, like a doorway, which is at once the leaving of one room and the entering of another. The mystics across all the traditions knew this paradox and circled it endlessly. Asterisk, die before you die, asterisk, they urged. The seed cannot become the tree unless it is willing to cease being a seed. It must fall into the dark earth and be undone before its hidden life can rise into the light. The grain of wheat that refuses to die remains forever, only a single grain. The asterisk conjuncture asterisk. The alchemist thought that sacred marriage, that union of opposites in which the divided psyche is at last made whole, could never be reached by addition alone. Something old had first to be sacrificed. The lower had to die for the higher to be born. There is no wholeness without a death. When was the last time you sensed it stirring? That strange double feeling of grief and longing, the part of you that is tired of the person you have been. Most people feel it and flee at once into work, into noise, into the next distraction the age so generously provides. but a few, and they are always few, feel it and grow still. They turn toward the knocking instead of away, and it is for these few that the door at last begins slowly to open. I think now of the man in my study, the one who could not bring himself to open the door in his dream and look upon the dying stranger. I did not tell him what the dream meant. One must never simply hand a person the meaning of his own soul. It would be a theft of the very experience that could heal him. I only asked him to return to the dream in his waking imagination, to go back to that closed door, and this time to lay his hand upon it. It took him many months, but there came a session when he arrived changed, quieter, with something settled and grave in his eyes that had not been there before. He told me he had finally opened the door, and the stranger on the bed, the one he had watched dying, had turned his head and looked back at him with his own face, and had smiled, and had said only one thing before the breath went out of him, asterisk, "Thank you for letting me go." He wept then, in a way I do not believe he had wept since he was a boy. It was the grief of a real and necessary funeral. He was burying the self he had been, the brittle, performing, exhausted self that had served him for 40 years and could serve him no longer. And in the weeks that followed, slowly and without fanfare, I watched a different man come into being in that chair. Not a happier man exactly, for happiness was never the point. Asterisk, truer asterisk one. A man who had at last become acquainted with the depths of himself, and who walked from then on with the unhurried gravity of someone who has met his own death and is no longer in flight from it. This is what I wish to place before you tonight, while the fire is low and the hour is late, and the ordinary defenses of the daylight mind have begun to loosen their grip. You will see it only once, that moment when the old self stands at the threshold and turns for the first and last time to look upon what it has been. You cannot summon it on demand, and you cannot survive it unchanged, and you cannot in the end avoid it forever, though the whole vast machinery of our age conspires to help you try. The unconscious will have its way with you. The only freedom you possess is in how you meet it. You may meet it in panic, calling your transformation a breakdown and fleeing back into the coffin of the old persona until the next and harder knock arrives. Or you may meet it the way the old initiates met it in the sacred caves and the mystery temples, consciously, willingly, with terror in your heart and a candle in your hand, descending into the dark. Not because you have lost your way, but because you have finally understood that the only way out is down and through. For until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So I will leave you, as I always do, not with an answer, but with a question, for the answer is not mine to give, and was never meant to be. The dying stranger in the empty house has been waiting a very long while behind a door you have learned not to see. And the question that remains, the one I would ask you to carry with you into the silence after I have stopped speaking, is only this. When your old self at last lies dying and turns its head and looks at you with your own face, what will you have to say to it? And when it has gone and the room is quiet, who will be standing there to begin?